Hi, I am Paul Baker Prindle, the Gabrielle Haberland Director of Madison Museum of Contemporary Art. This is The Layered Onion. I came to visual art making as a college student. I was not a visual arts person as a young person. I was a musician. I was a very gifted musician. I was homeschooled so that I could concertize and study music more intensely. And that really started, yes, quite young. I was always musical. And
Strings?
Piano, drums, trumpet, a few other things. But really piano was my main instrument. And I can't imagine a life without music. I'm very much a music person. But I would say in high school, I wasn't enjoying the pressure of the track I was on very much. And then, I went off to college, and what happened really, I was always good with cameras. I liked making photographs, but I never thought of myself as a future practicing artist. And I went to college, I did a study abroad, and I had a very serious accident. And I came back early, and to make up time, I took some summer classes, and I decided I would take a ceramics class. And I had a lot of injuries, and I wanted to get my body moving again. So I decided to learn the kick wheel with my left leg. I'm a righty. And so I actually really came into visual art by chance. And that accent also spelled the end of my career as a musician. I had been teaching at a conservatory and still playing, but I came to art on accident, visual art. At the time I was making this transition sort of out of music and into visual art, I did not consciously recognize it as a healing path. I, in retrospect, see it as that. And actually, even at the time, it's sort of funny that I didn't recognize it. I remember very specifically, I didn't have a memory of this accident. And I remember going to my doctor and asking her to show me pictures from textbooks of similar injuries. And looking back, I recognized just how visual I am, and that I needed to see what had happened to me to understand it. And I would say now that's sort of a core realization of how my brain works and how my spirit works. Like, I need to see things. And then it really wasn't until graduate school when I started working on this series documenting hate crime sites, which, on the face of it looks like it's about hate crimes. And in one way it is, but it actually, I came to it trying to make sense of memory. And the truth, and I don't talk about this very much relative to that work, is that what had happened is I had gone back to the place where I had had this accident and had hoped that by visiting it, it would help me remember what had happened. And it didn't. And I became very fascinated with theories around melancholic obsession and how we can focus on things and it becomes a sort of self-feeding cycle that kind of prevents you working through. And that just sort of sent me on a deep path, and that manifested through that work where I was going to sites where these horrible traumatic things had happened. But in the photograph, you don't see any indication of that. And it becomes quite dissonant in that way. And that really is the truth of why I was making that work, is And I would not say it was like a catharsis or a conscious sort of art therapy. I was more interested in exploring this kind of intellectual realization I had had about trauma and our brains' capacities for making sense of trauma. It's not, objects from that series are in different museums, and I continue to make that work. But the whole collection, I've been to 70 sites.
Oh my goodness.
But it keeps growing. And over time that series in particular has taken on a life of its own, and it's become different things, in part because of what I've learned from visitors and viewers of the work. And I think I realized this very early on, but this body of work has particularly been useful in really solidifying my feelings on this, that I do think that artists make things very often with intent, but I feel pretty firm in my feeling that once you make it and you put out in the world, it is both yours and not yours anymore. And what the viewer does with it is just as valuable. And so that's been a really kind of wonderful emotional and intellectual dimension of making that body of work, because I note that very often mothers have a similar reaction to the work. Queer people have a different reaction to it. How much people have thought about the photographic image, and if they live with photographs themselves as memory objects, affects how they deal with it. And that's been very instructive and enriching, actually, for me as an artist, to absorb and think about how people deal with those images, because they, for the most part, are peaceful. And sometimes they're attractive. They're not meant to be beautiful images, but sometimes they are. And then I think the work of, you're told what's happened there in the title, and then you do this thing of imagining what's happened there. And I think that's a really interesting and telling experience, how the viewer makes sense of that and what they bring to that interpretive moment. I did a talk a long time ago. It wasn't a talk, it was an interview with Jean Faraka. And I remember actually kind of the only moment I remember of that was talking to her about the ways in which particularly gay men, and I think most women, have in common is this ever-present specter of violence that attends our lives, that everywhere we go, you have in the back of your mind that something could happen to you, something violent could happen to you because of who you are. And that, I remember that moment very clearly, as a moment of connection, because she understood what I was talking about, because she lives her life as a woman. And she knows what it's like to walk down a street alone, or to be in an elevator or a parking garage. And that was, when I started making that work, I hadn't anticipated those kinds of emotional connections. I had never planned on being a professional artist. And I had never wanted, I don't have the constitution to make a living off of art making. It's too anxious for me. I like to know where my check is coming and that it will be there. I'm not cut out for that. And to be honest, art making has always been more of an intellectual pursuit. I'm very interested in visual text as a discursive mode and this way of making sense of the world through images. And I have to say, when I first started, that notion was not anywhere near as pervasive as it is now. I would argue that actually most of us do most of our thinking and speaking in images now. We talk far less than we deal with images because we're on Instagram and X and, all these social media platforms exchanging information through images. But, 20 years ago when I first started making work in grad school, it was a different world. And I remember, you had to write, a 20, 30, 40 page thesis to accompany your visual work because the academy had not yet sort of accepted that, making art is enough. But yeah, it was always a sort of intellectual pursuit, a means of channeling my curiosity about how the world works. And I had come from a family that had been in politics, and I had some of my earliest memories were helping with my grandfather's fundraisers or some other thing my grandparents were fundraising for. And so I sort of had it in my bones to be in this business because so much of what I do is talking to people and raising money. Right. And so I found myself in an internship, and then I got a job offer at a museum, and it just sort of snowballed. And I realized that the path I was on wasn't really accidental. It was always kind of meant to be. And I think the process was sort of accepting what my path was. I think that's part of becoming an adult, maybe.
And you spent a couple years in China?
I taught 3 summers in China at Chinese universities. One university for 2 years, and then I moved to a different university. I also taught in Italy as well. I would say that the professional path I started really leaning into, it came with, I was working at university museums that were at state schools. And those had strong codes of ethics and conflict of interest rules. And, the way our industry works is that, especially if you're an artist and you're traveling in artist circles, the boundaries between, sort of the arts administrator, curator, director, and the artist can get even more complicated because you now have access to resources that are funded by taxpayers. And so I sort of pulled back from making and exhibiting art publicly and kind of trying to dance in both worlds. Because again, I didn't want to make a living as an artist anyway, so it wasn't hard for me. And I found that being an arts administrator and supporting the work and the careers of artists was also a creative endeavor. And it feels many times and in many ways like my arts practice. I would say the same. I'm a big gardener, and I've always worked with color. And gardening has allowed me to work with color as an artist. And so I would say that I've never felt any sort of loss over not making art publicly. I still make it, but I started leaning into other things that I think felt very much like my creative practice still. And I feel really comfortable with that. And there's a real joy in, I think because I'm an artist, I can relate to artists as they're developing their work. And I understand many of the things they're thinking about and going through and the questions they're asking. And so I think it all kind of works really nicely in an integrated way. I think overall I have a pretty integrated sense of self and my talents, and I don't necessarily have to keep them in separate bins. Yeah, there's more flexibility, and I can make work about what I want and not have to be pleasing a collector or rushing to make work for an exhibition. I just get to do what I want, which is nice. Yeah, and I get a regular paycheck. I think Madison's an incredibly complex place. It's not easy to answer that question because it's one of the most highly educated cities in the country. Certainly, it's a small city, right? I think also the the influence of European culture. Of course, Ho-Chunk have been living here for thousands of years, but the sort of European culture that has set the mode of this town is this kind of Northern European, work hard, don't stick out, strong commitment to the social contract. I think those are, in many ways, really positive things that have helped Madison become the strong community it is. And I think that the sort of intellectual strengths of the community make this enterprise we're involved with at the museum, what we're really about is using visual information as a means for making sense of today. And that's slightly different than what museums who show historical material are doing. Mm-hmm. And so I think the fact that, the education system in Wisconsin in general and in Madison in particular are so strong makes for really great partners in what we're doing through our mission work. I think at the same time, some of the problems that have bedeviled Madison for as long as I've been around Madison persist. Because I think we have a deep openness to others here, yet it's a fairly monolithic place. And I don't know that we fully understand why that is. And I certainly think we haven't really conquered that. And so I think that also makes it challenging in kind of operational ways. Inviting people to join our team from afar can be tricky. I know, moving back, I was reminded there's no Sephardic temple here for me to go to. There aren't a ton of grocery stores that have the food that I like to eat. I think it's also a town that's going through major change. I mean, for most of its history, it was a government and education center. And now I think, medical tech and computer engineering has really been contributing to massive change that we also haven't quite figured out yet. Mm-hmm. So I think overall that makes for a really interesting opportunity as the director of a contemporary art museum, because this is very much what contemporary art museums do, is they function as these kind of third spaces. And I say this with a little bit of hyperbole, but to some degree, the art can sometimes almost be ancillary. It's the tool. I'm going to get in trouble for saying that, but it's the material that we use to bring people together. And I think together around what our main mission is, which is to get people talking to each other. And I think as a human living on this planet, not just as a Madisonian or a Wisconsinite, but just living in today's world, I can't think of many other purposes that I think are more important. I think we are living through a crisis. It may be a productive crisis, but a crisis of what it means to be a human. I think technology has so quickly changed how we perceive ourselves and how we relate to each other and how we live. Even just like our biological processes are changing. And so the opportunity to come back to a community, one, that it gave so much to me, and with a community of people who, by and large, are really invested in being their best selves and their best citizens and their best community members, that's a very motivating opportunity. You want to take advantage of that and be part of that. And I think there's so much opportunity to make an impact, and to do that in partnership with others, who work at the museum, who visit the museum. We decided to bring a restaurant into the former shop space for a lot of practical reasons. Retail on State Street has really shifted. It's almost impossible to make it anymore, for all sorts of reasons. whereas State Street is also becoming more entertainment and food focused. But my inner self, I come from a culture that eats around everything. We celebrate holidays around food. Food is everything. And food is this thing that we all must do. It's like one of the few things that all of us do. We're born, we sleep, we eat, we die. Those are things everybody does. Not everybody gets married. Not everybody lives in a house. We all do those things. And what I really want for Madison, what I want for this museum, is for it to be a place where people stick around. We talk about sticky spots a lot when we're planning programs and thinking about how we operate. And a restaurant is a place where you most often come together. I mean, I love to eat out alone, but most of the time people go to restaurants together, and you go and you sit and you talk, and you're able to talk at a restaurant in a way that you might not be able to do at home because someone's got to be cooking at home, right? So we really wanted to emphasize this notion that a museum is a place to linger. I think also when I've lived outside of Wisconsin, something I talk a lot about with people is that I think Wisconsin has just an amazing food culture. It is such a part of the state's history. It's such a part of the university's history. And we make amazing food. We grow amazing food here. And I think there's a real art to that. And so it just really made sense to us. And I think then partnering with a chef like Elena Terry, who really is an artist, making food is so creative. I mean, even on the domestic scale, I mean, I don't know, maybe you've seen this, but there's this really famous reel of Aretha Franklin. She's being asked what like the hardest thing she does is, and she answers just deciding what to make for dinner. And a lot of the responses to that have been, I think, a little bit of a misunderstanding of what she was saying. I actually think she was tying it to her creative practice. That, like, as a mother, thinking about what you're going to make every night really is a creative pursuit. And how, because I think anyone who has raised a child knows getting your kid to eat and to nourish them and get them to grow properly is not just a science, it is an art. And so I think a lot about that little reel, because I think it's instructive. And so for us, it just made a lot of sense. And I think moreover, we were really lucky to partner with an Indigenous woman. I'm very aware that our museum, State Street, the Capitol building, is built on top of the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk. And I think we were really lucky to partner with someone who is such a skilled chef in so many different culinary traditions, who also has this relationship to the land that is, I think, something we mustn't ignore. We have to be aware where we are.
Skilled community builder.
She's such a skilled community builder. Yeah. She has a warmth that is very disarming and brings people together in really lovely ways. Yeah. We're really lucky. I'm excited. I absolutely had an interest in coming back because of how unique Madison Museum of Contemporary Art is, especially relative to its location. I think it's a really unique place. Like any good Madisonian, I have lots of opinions. And I think there are things that I want to see grow and mature and develop on State Street, and I wanted to be part of that. I think State Street is one of the most amazing downtown main streets in the country. And I think we're at a crossroads with what it looks like and what we do with it moving forward. And there are a lot of external pressures in that mix. And because the museum is not only on this really incredible, not fully, though it should be, pedestrian street, and, roughly, although a little closer to Capitol, but roughly between the Capitol and a university that our state for over a century has decided we're going to invest heavily in because we think it's important. We're in a really great spot. I think we are sort of like a cultural agora on this kind of forum street. And that's a very enviable resource for any museum director. And I think we're only just starting to really get into a sense of what we can do with that location moving forward. Our thinking on planning is always evolving. Some things are sort of nascent. Some things are a little bit more set. I think there are a lot of variables yet. I think downtown in particular is becoming much younger, much, much younger. And it's not college students that are driving that. The college population hasn't changed that much. Mm-hmm. It is younger. People are wealthier because of the jobs they have. What we are really responding to is a realization, though, that the kind of traditional marketing demographics that have dominated planning for companies and organizations for decades are not really holding up anymore. And an early realization I had was that what we were really starting to see more and more of is that downtown Madison was becoming more urbane, and the sort of cultural habits around urbanity were not limited to one economic demographic group or an age group, that actually we were seeing 28-year-olds and 65-year-olds being interested in the same things. And I think a great example is like the condos that we've all seen sprout up downtown. The residents are your, med tech workers who are just starting their careers, but also retirees. And, there are retirees who are out in Middleton and, Edgerton, the quieter areas, but there are people who are choosing to retire downtown because they want that life. Mm-hmm. And I think that shift in Madison is picking up more and more steam, and we're really planning around that, and realizing that there will be ways that our mission was expressed in the past that might not remain moving forward because of some of the realities of Madison's growth. I think one of the biggest realizations we've had relative to that is we've become so big that this isthmus, which has not changed, is much harder to get down to. Yeah. And so we are finding ourselves rebalancing what we offer and to whom and when. So we do much more for families on the weekends because what we know from studies is that there are actually very few people under 18 living on the isthmus anymore. And if you're a parent, you're not picking your kid up at a West Side school, feeding them, changing them, getting homework done, and driving all the way down here during the week. You're not. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really, I'm fascinated by the opportunities to respond to that. I also find it really interesting in that so many of us, myself included, who are administrators, were trained in a lot of the same techniques and theories and practices that MBAs are, and this sort of model of kind of capitalist growth that if you're not getting bigger and bigger, you're not succeeding. And what's really interesting to me is that we are now in a spot at the museum where we really can't serve everyone anymore. And that's actually liberating. And that we have an opportunity to support up and coming organizations who can infill. And we can also judge our success and build metrics around being really good at what we've decided to be really good at, and releasing ourselves of this sort of anxiety that we are trained to have over, well, you're not getting bigger, your operating budget isn't getting bigger, your audience isn't getting bigger, all those things. We can really decide what metrics we want to define for ourselves. And I think more than ever, our museum's in a spot to really think about quality because of a lot of the changes that are happening in Madison. I think what's so fascinating and powerful about MoCA is, we're celebrating our 125th year this year. And for that entire time, we have been free. And it's really important for me, and so much of my work is organized around helping people feel like the museum is for them. It's low stakes. You don't have to pay admission. You can come in. If you don't like what you see, you can leave right away, and there's no loss, right? And I think somewhere along the line, we trained Americans to think you had to be highly educated, or you had to know something, or you had to dress a certain way or behave a certain way to come to a museum. And I get how that happens. But I don't really care if you come in your sweatpants. I don't really care if you come in for 5 minutes. I don't care if you come in for an hour and for 45 minutes of that, you're on your phone. I think it's really important for people to recognize that cultural organizations and especially free museums like ours and the Chazen and others in town are this really kind of incredible place where you can come as you are and take away what you want. Like, you don't have to have learned something really powerful. You don't have to have, there's no right way to museum. How you do it is the right way. And I hope that in my tenure here, as long as I'm lucky enough to be the director, I think that's really what I want to make an impact on, is just helping more Madisonians and Wisconsinites and people who are traveling from afar just realize, like, you can come in and do whatever you want, really. We have very few rules. Don't touch, don't run, don't bring food and drink in. And then other than that, we're good. You can talk loudly. You can kiki with your friends. Doesn't really matter. I want to get away from this kind of church-like attitude. It's so good for you to see art. It's good for your health. It's good, it's good for your spirit. And I think this time we're in is just so anxious. And maybe just to gift yourself 5 or 10 minutes to just walk in, pass through, and look at one beautiful thing for the day. We're very lucky to be able to do that and not have to pay for it and to have it right downtown. And we've worked very hard over the last year to be friendlier, to take some of the mystery out. We've purchased a lot of furniture. I'm a person with a chronic disease. I can't stand that long. Museum floors are usually hard. Nobody can stand. And then even if you have a chair, often there are benches, you need arms, So we're working as fast as we can to make it as hospitable as possible so that the only thing standing in the way of you coming is you. I am Paul Baker Prindle, the Gabrielle Haberland Director of Madison Museum of Contemporary Art, and this was The Layered Onion.